Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to a read-along of Federalist number 7, where we're going to go line by line through the 18th century language Alexander Hamilton presents to us in the Federalist, as I said, number 7. We're going to see if we can't untangle some of the language, see what he has to say. So, without further ado, we're going to get pretty much right into it. I will say thank you for coming. Oh, and I am going to remind you, while I have read these and reviewed them for founderoftheday.com in the past, it's been 6 months, 8 months since I've done so. So, it's a little bit fresh in my mind, and we'll journey together. So let's hop on over here. If you want to read along, there is a link in the description below to exactly what I'm reading on my website. And here we go. Federalist number 7, the same subject continued, concerning dangers from dissensions between the states. For the Independent Journal, which was in New York, November 15th, 1787, by Alexander Hamilton. First of all, this is one day after he published number 6. It is about the same topic, a topic kind of preluded by the earlier John Jay writings. And what's very interesting, I want to point out, is John Jay started several of his with the same subject continued. And I like that they kept the continuity because they were presenting themselves as one author, Publius. Although most Anti-Federalists were just one author that we know of. This was certainly 3. John Jay, who did a bunch of the early ones and has disappeared, and will come back for number 64 in a while, and then mostly Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. So, to the people of the state of New York, as they're always addressed, because they are trying to encourage New York specifically. Let's see what he has to say. It is sometimes asked, with an air of seeming triumph, what inducements could the states have if disunited to make war upon each other? So here he's immediately kind of throwing out an anti-federalist criticism of the Constitution. If we didn't unite on the Constitution, why would we go to war with each other? There's no reason. We're all friends here. And we'll see what Hamilton has to say about that. It would be a full answer to this question to say precisely the same inducements which have, at different times, deluged in blood all nations in the world. So I can answer that really quick, says Alexander Hamilton. Any reason anyone's ever gone to war would apply here. But unfortunately for us, the question admits of a more particular answer. Oh, so I have completed the answer to that question, but unfortunately, there's more answer than the one I told you was just complete. There are causes of differences within our immediate contemplation of the tendency of which, even under the restraints of a federal constitution, we have had sufficient experience to enable us to form a judgment of what might be expected if those restraints were removed. That one is a mouthful. So, causes of differences within our immediate contemplation. So, right now, as we're discussing it, there are some things we need to talk about, a tendency of which, even under the restraints of a federal constitution, we had sufficient experience to enable us. So, essentially, because of the situation we're in, when he says the federal constitution this time, he is pretty much referencing the Articles of Confederation. Even under the restraints of a federal constitution, we have experienced us to a judgment of what might be expected. So, because of our situation, we can look around what's happening and see why a war would break out between the states, even without the Constitution. Territorial disputes have at all times been found one of the most fertile sources of hostility among nations. So, usually nations go to war because their neighbors want the land they have and or they want the land their neighbors have. Perhaps the greatest proportion of wars that have desolated the earth have sprung from this origin. So, most of the wars, according to Hamilton, perhaps, most of the wars in the history of the world were fought over land. This cause would exist among us in full force. Not much to say there. His contemporary states are in it because I'm assuming he's going to say they live right next to each other. We have a vast tract of unsettled territory within the boundaries of the United States. So this he's primarily referencing the Northwest Territory, though upstate New York was still far from settled, western parts of Georgia, North Carolina. Kentucky was then considered Virginia, Tennessee was considered North Carolina, but this was all quickly changing, and it was unsettled. But primarily Northwest Territory, because that was under essentially national control at the time. There still are discordant and undecided claims between several of them, and the dissolution of the Union would lay foundation for similar claims between them all. So he is saying, even under the Articles of Confederation, there is some disagreement about who owns what land. Oh, he is probably referencing Vermont very specifically, because Vermont thought it was its own thing, New Hampshire thought it was New Hampshire, and New York thought it was New York. Although there were other issues on the border of South Carolina and Georgia, Maryland and Virginia, Pennsylvania and Virginia, there were a lot of debates of this nature. Okay. It is well known that they have heretofore had serious and animated discussions concerning the rights to the land which were ungranted at the time of the Revolution, and which usually went under the name of crown lands. You know, before we go on, I want to make one more note that at this time the Yankee Pennamite Wars were being fought over what we now consider northern Pennsylvania. Connecticut and Pennsylvania both claimed it and actually broke out in violence on a few occasions. As for this sentence, well known that they have heretofore serious and animated discussions, so they have been very, if not angry, nervous with each other, talking, trying to settle who owns what land. And as he says here, a lot of it went under the name of crown land, so the king would just say, okay, it's my land, you guys shut up over there. And that was an easy solution that they no longer have. Okay, this is an especially long sentence, we'll break it in half. The states within the limits of whose colonial governments they were comprised have claimed them as their property. The others have contended that the rights of the crown in this article devolve upon the Union. So, territories that seem to be within state charters or under state control, they were often claimed to be the king's property, and now we are not sure who's in charge of it, although those states certainly think it's theirs. Especially as to all that part of the Western Territory, which, either by actual possession or through the submission of Indian proprietors, was subject to the jurisdiction of the King of Great Britain till it was relinquished by the Treaty of Peace. So, again, he's specifically at this point talking about the Northwest Territory as it was then known, and saying that there's a big question of who actually owns that. The king, many of you will remember the proclamation of 1763, just after the French and Indian War concluded, basically said everything west of the Appalachian Mountains is the king's land and you don't get it. It was one of the more underrated causes of the Revolutionary War, especially like Virginia landowners who owned all this property out there and wanted to sell it, and the king said you can't go. Now that the king's gone, you can go, but whose land, which state is actually in charge of it? This, as it has been said, was at all events an acquisition to the Confederacy by compact with a foreign power. So because of the Treaty of Paris that ended the war, these events are, the Northwest Territory is actually owned by the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation, which is probably more appropriately called the Confederation Congress. Though they did still call it the Continental Congress, we differ that as students of history by calling it the Continental Association. Either way, the Continental Association really owned this land. That's what's so important about the Northwest Indian. The name's escaping me. Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which kind of started to determine how those territories could later become states. It has been the prudent policy of Congress to appease this controversy by prevailing upon the states to make cessions to the United States for the benefit of the whole. So this happened on several occasions, but the notable one is really Maryland didn't sign the Articles of Confederation until way later than everyone else, because Virginia was claiming all the land in the Northwest that had essentially been captured during the war by Virginian George Rogers Clark, since a Virginian was leading that part of the Continental Army and mostly Virginia militia to do that conquering, and Kentucky was already a county in Virginia, then this should all be Virginia's land. And it wasn't until Virginia said, okay, we will give this land we captured during the Revolutionary War to the Continental Congress as a peace offering, so to speak, with Maryland, for Maryland to finally sign. And that's what he's referencing here. This has been so far accomplished as, under a continuation of the Union, to afford a decent prospect of an amicable termination of the dispute. So he's saying because there was the Union under the Articles of Confederation, we were able to settle this dispute without violence or anger of any nature. A dismemberment of the Confederacy, however, would revive this dispute and would create others on the same subject. So what he's saying here is, should we not unite on... I want to pause here because he's, again, the Federalists come out strong in these papers, criticizing basically the Anti-Federalists as people who wanted no union whatsoever, which again isn't true. Almost all the Anti-Federalists did want something better than the Articles of Confederation. They wanted a stronger union. They just didn't necessarily want this national government. But again, as I will remind you, these are propaganda pieces that were written to sway public opinion in a certain direction. So when Hamilton here says a dismemberment of the Confederacy, he is alluding to the idea that the Anti-Federalists, as they did not call themselves, were hoping to split the Union apart, which really primarily wasn't true. There were, of course, people who did think that was the right way to go, but primarily most people did not think that at the time. But he's using that attitude to promote his idea. Dismemberment of the Confederacy, however, would revive the dispute and make it worse. So if we split up, then now, look, there's going to be fighting over the Northwest Territory. But again, they weren't saying split up of that nature. Most Anti-Federalists realized that this would have been a problem had they had no union whatsoever. But again, he's in a way trying to defame Anti-Federalist opinions by pushing on them an opinion they generally didn't actually have. So don't think that started today. That's not a new thing. At present, a large part of the vacant Western Territory is, by cession at least, if not by any anterior right, the common property of the United States. So when he's writing this, the Northwest Territory was in fact owned by the United States as a union. It was essentially a federal territory, but not in name. If that were at an end, the states which made the cession on principle of federal compromise would be apt, when the motive of the grant had ceased, to reclaim the lands as a reversion. So he's saying that if we split up, like some of my opponents apparently want, as at least that's what he's claiming, then there's going to be some disagreement over who gets control of that territory. The other states would no doubt insist on a proportion by the right of representation. So, basically Virginia would lay claim to most of the Northwest Territory, and the other states would want at least part of that because they own, under the Union, they own a share of it. Right? Their argument would be that a grant once made cannot be revoked, and that the justice of participating in territory acquired or secured by the joint efforts of the Confederacy remained undiminished. So again, once the property was given to the Union, all of the states had some share in it, if not an equal share, and they would feel, legally, in legal terms, that they deserve a piece of that. If, contrary to probability, it should be admitted by all the states that each had a right to share of this common stock, there would still be difficulty to be surmounted as to a proper rule of apportionment. So, each had a right to... So, if it was the case that every state, Virginia, admitted that when the Union splits up, we should divide up this land equally, it would still be difficult to determine who was ruling which land. Are we all going to rule different parts of it? That doesn't make any sense. Different principles would be set up by different states for this purpose, and as they would affect the opposite interests of the parties, they might not easily be susceptible of a pacific adjustment. So since the different states are going to set up different territorial governors and they'll all be surrounded by each other, they're going to have different interests based on the states back home that are sending them their instructions, then just the transition itself would be hard to keep peaceable. All right. In the wide field of Western territory, therefore, We perceive an ample theater for hostile presentations, without any umpire or common judge to interpose between the contending parties. So, out there in the West, there's not a lot of overruling, but even if we send different territorial governors, there's not one common judge, or as he says, umpire, which is a word I didn't realize they were using back then. Thought that was a baseball term. Although, they were playing modified forms of baseball at that point, but I don't want to digress. In the field of Western Territory, so it's going to be very ripe for violence to break out between these different territories. To reason from the past to the future, we shall have good ground to apprehend that the sword would sometimes be appealed to as the arbiter of their differences. So we can look at history to determine that this situation would obviously lead to some kind of violence. Okay. The circumstances of the dispute between Connecticut and Pennsylvania respecting the land at Wyoming admonish us not to be sanguine in expecting an easy accommodation of such differences. So this is what I was referencing earlier, the Yankee-Pennamite Wars. When he says Wyoming here, he doesn't mean the state of Wyoming. Northwestern Pennsylvania is the Wyoming territory or valley. I think it's the Wyoming Valley they call it, but they call that area Wyoming. Although today it's kind of like the Poconos. That being said, there was a series of wars that broke out before, during, and just after the Revolution. And it was settlers that came from Pennsylvania and settlers that came from Connecticut were settling there, and they didn't like that they were settling on each other's territory, and they actually broke out into violence on several occasions. They weren't really wars, that's just kind of what they call them, but there were skirmishes, and it happened. Very much similar to what was happening in Vermont between people of New Hampshire that later became those running Vermont and people of New York who were seen by the people living there as intruders. The Articles of Confederation oblige the parties to submit the matter to the decision of a federal court. So real quick, he doesn't capitalize Articles or Confederation, which usually that's the name of something, and they like to capitalize things back then. I am always kind of shocked. I don't know if he did that on purpose as a way to subliminally belittle the Articles of Confederation. But you would think he would have capitalized that because that is the government that he is at this point living under and trying to overthrow, for lack of a better term, with the Constitution, of course. But the government they had, the Articles of Confederation, made it so that people had to, if there were disagreements of this nature, then the federal court, as he says, would see it fit. That federal court is essentially the Continental Congress. There was one federal court, appeals of cases of capture, but that mostly oversaw ships at sea. Okay, how long is this? All right, not too long, we do. The submission was made, and the court decided in favor of Pennsylvania. But Connecticut gave strong indications of dissatisfaction with that determination. Nor did she appear to be entirely resigned to it, till, by negotiation and management, something like an equivalent was found for the loss she supposed herself to have sustained. So, the Continental Congress, a federal government, did resolve this issue between the states. It gave it to Pennsylvania, and Connecticut was real unhappy. But they did give Connecticut some lands and such to repay it for what it felt it had lost. Granted, it didn't really pay Connecticut anything. Connecticut had claimed a land in the Northwest Territory that it kind of said, you can settle this land, we'll call it even. Believe it or not, that's why a lot of northern Ohio was settled by, a lot of Ohio in general was settled by Connecticut. Citizens of Connecticut who traveled out there. Nothing here said is intended to convey the slightest censure on the conduct of that state. So I'm not trying to talk trash about Connecticut, just trying to point out what's going on. She no doubt sincerely believed herself to have been injured by the decision, and states, like individuals, acquiesce with great reluctance in determinations to their disadvantage. So, Connecticut rightfully was unhappy with the decision, and much like people, states and nations, when they are found to, they're told they are losing something that they thought they owned, they react, they get sad. They sad. All right. Let's see. This is a pretty long. Okay, not bad. We'll do the whole sentence. It's a little long, but we'll do it. Those who had an opportunity of seeing the inside of the transactions which attended the progress of the controversy between this state and the District of Vermont can vouch the opposition we experienced, as well from states not interested as from those which were interested in the claim, and can attest the danger to which the peace of the Confederacy might have been exposed had this state attempted to assert its rights by force. So here, when he's referencing this state, he's talking about New York. He is writing in New York to the people of New York. And this is a good tactic to get your very direct readers, get them involved personally in the arguments you're trying to make. Those who had the opportunity of seeing inside. So he's kind of outing himself as a New Yorker who at least at one point was in the Continental Congress, because he was in the Continental Congress when New York and New Hampshire decided about Vermont. And Vermont was kind of originally given to New Hampshire during the Continental Congress, though everyone knew it would eventually become its own thing. But he's saying, like, we, New York, wanted this land, and we were told no by the Continental Congress. And we experienced opposition from not only that state, but other states that were not even a part of it can point out what a tough decision it was against us, and we're still not happy about it. He actually calls it, and then he says, if it weren't for the Confederacy, we might have had to use force and go to war with New Hampshire. Now again, he's kind of disproving his own argument here, because the Confederacy did the job he's saying we need the Constitution to do, but an anti-federalist might say, but no, look, the Confederacy did it fine, just fine. Two motives preponderated in that opposition. One, a jealousy entertained of our future power, and the other, the interest of certain individuals of influence in the neighboring states who had obtained grants of land under the actual government of that district. So, people who were against New York getting Vermont. The two types of people. One, people jealous of our future power. So people who were afraid New York was getting a little too big for its britches. I'll remind you, at this point, New York was skyrocketing in population, especially New York City. And it was not one of the most powerful states yet, but it was clearly on its way. And therefore, people were afraid that New York might get a little too powerful. Well, let's take some of their land and give it to these hillbillies in Vermont. Sorry, Vermont, nothing personal. That was essentially the attitude at the time. These Green Mountain Boys. The other type of person were individuals of influence in neighboring states. So rich people in other states who had bought some of the land from New Hampshire and didn't want to lose it, because if New York took over, then any purchases made through New Hampshire would be evaporated. They wouldn't matter at all. Waste of money. Even the states which brought forward claims in contradiction to ours seemed more solicitous to dismember this state than establish their own pretensions. So even the other states who made claims like this didn't really care about getting the land. They just seemed to care about prohibiting New York from becoming too powerful. Is he going to out them? These were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Now, New Hampshire, as I said, Vermont was called the New Hampshire Grants. Most of those people from New Hampshire, though Connecticut did lay claim to it. Not a very good claim, and there were many people from Connecticut who did settle Vermont with the people of New Hampshire before New York really started sending people in there. I mean, after all, the Connecticut River does run through Vermont, so you can see Connecticut's claim. Massachusetts also made some claims, although it was far from perfect. They barely, I'm surprised he includes them on this list, probably just to kind of beef it up a little bit. Though they did have some claim to some part of it, because it does border New Hampshire. New Jersey and Rhode Island, upon all occasions, discovered a warm zeal for the independence of Vermont, and Maryland, till alarmed by the appearance of a connection between Canada and that state, entered deeply into the same views. So New Jersey and Rhode Island, they didn't want anyone else to get this land. They wanted it to be independent, because then they could be their own thing. New York would be less powerful, Massachusetts would be less powerful, Connecticut, everyone else would be less powerful. And New Jersey and Rhode Island, small little Rhode Island there, didn't want New England states to get any bigger. In fact, having a smaller state like Vermont could be very advantageous to a smaller state like Rhode Island. And New Jersey, again, one of the middle states, but edging on smaller state, probably thought it would be best for them for the same reason. Maryland, as he said, also thought of the same thing until they heard that Canada and that state had a connection. So that's a reference to the Haldimand affair, where, as you know, the British Army approached Benedict Arnold and asked if he wanted to switch sides, and he did. You might not know, they approached many generals in the American Army who didn't. They also approached Vermont, who, during the war in 1776, Vermont just says, forget it, and declares independence. We're our own state. We're our own nation. Get away from us. They, of course, did fight with the Patriots because the goal of being an independent state was to eventually become a state in the Union. But the Haldimand affair, it was when the leaders of Vermont were approached by certain Brits through Canada to see if they wanted to cede from the Union and become part of Canada. The Green Mountain Boys were pretty good fighters. It would be nice to have them on their side. That being said, it seems that Ethan Allen, his brother Ira Allen, Seth Warner, not so much Seth Warner, I shouldn't have said that name, but a few of the other important early leaders of that state, they all decide, essentially, let's play both parties against each other. So they pretend to be more friendly with Britain than they actually were, but they also kind of let it leak that they're talking to Britain to convince some of the other states in the Union, oh, okay, maybe we should just let them become a state. Now, obviously, that backfired, according to Hamilton, because Maryland changes its mind about Vermont independence as soon as they find that out. These being small states saw with an unfriendly eye the perspective of our growing greatness and have being literally fresh off the Constitutional Convention. This is less than 2 months after Alexander Hamilton signs the Constitution. He's writing these words in New York. So some of the small states were given some trouble through the Constitutional Convention, you probably know. So he's probably a little biased. And these being small states saw us getting great, growing super powerful. They were not very happy about it. In a review of these transactions, we may trace some of the causes which would likely be likely to embroil the states with each other, if it should be their unpropitious destiny to become disunited. Again, following up with just being disunited, again, he's essentially basing this whole article on the idea that there are people out there who want to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, have no union. He keeps using that phrase, and that is really very far from the truth. I've read here on this channel, I've spoken about dozens of different papers of Anti-Federalists and have not once come across at least a major Anti-Federalist making that claim. Okay. The competitions of commerce would be another fruitful source of contention. So, he's moving on from the first he was discussing land and the people disagreeing over who owns what territory as a reason wars and hostility might break out without the Union. Now he's moving on to trade. Let's see here. The states less favorably circumstanced would be desirous of escaping from the disadvantages of local situation and of sharing in the advantages of their more fortunate neighbors. So states who are not as wealthy will want to get some of their neighbors' wealth. Each state or separate confederacy would pursue a system of commercial policy particular to itself. So again, referencing separate confederacies as has been discussed in the last several papers. While the idea of no union at all was very uncommon, few people did bring up the idea of having a few smaller confederated governments, a mid-Atlantic government, a New England government, that kind of thing. Though again, you don't hear it very often. And what he's saying, should this happen, should we break up into pieces, each state would have its own economy and therefore be doing things to make itself wealthy in its own way. This would occasion distinctions, preferences, and exclusions, which would beget discontent. So because they have different economies, trying to make their own money, they don't really care about each other's economies, and there would be some unhappiness between the friends. The inhabitants of intercourse on the basis of equal privileges, to which we have been accustomed since the earliest settlement of the country, would give a keener edge to those of discontent than they would naturally have independent of this circumstance. So the habits of intercourse on the basis of equal privilege, this is a tough one to break down. The habits of equal privilege, which have best been accustomed to the earliest settlement of the country. So because we share our economies, even though that's only half true because most of the colonies had different currencies and there were problems between the currencies, which to we be accustomed would give a keener edge than those that cause the different. So basically, We naturally share economies, and to break that up would give us reasons to be angry at each other that we don't currently have. And here, again, Hamilton's boldness, not mine. We should be ready to denominate injuries. We should be ready to denominate injuries those things which were in reality the justifiable acts of independent sovereignties consulting a distinct interest. Should be ready to denominate injuries. So if we're acting in our own self-interest because we want our own economies to succeed, we are going to get angry at our neighbors if they do better than us, and if they don't do as good as us, we're going to try and squash them because we're acting to distinct interests. The spirit of enterprise, which characterizes the commercial part of America, has left no occasion of displaying itself unimproved. So the spirit of enterprise which characterizes America, just American, good old American, what's the phrase? Not intuition, but pull yourself up by your bootstraps. American exceptionalism, which is not being talked about, would be a term that comes around later, but here he is essentially talking about it. The commercial part of America is very enterprising, always trying to succeed, and we don't want to leave itself unimproved. Americans are going to keep trying to make their economy better. It's just our natural way of life. It is not at all probable that this unbridled spirit would pay much respect to those regulations of trade by which particular states might endeavor to secure exclusive benefits to their own citizens. So, because we're always out there trying to make that cash, trying to get that bag, we are going to try and skirt any trade regulations which states will try and put things into place that will make their own nation, their own economies better. And people who will try and get around those, no matter what. The infractions of these regulations on the one side, the efforts to prevent and repel them on the other the infractions of these regulations on the one side, the efforts to prevent and repel them on the other would naturally lead to outrages and these to reprisals and war. So as different states make regulations against each other, things like import tariffs and that nature, eventually people are going to get angry and it's going to lead to war. The opportunities which some states would have of rendering others tributary to them by commercial regulations would be impatiently submitted to by the tributary states. So because some states are going to get more powerful and have better economies, the smaller states next to them are going to have to do what the bigger states want. They will have to concede certain things they don't want to do to make sure their neighbor still trades with them and helps their economy. Because in self-interest, that is the only thing they'll be able to do, according to Hamilton. The relative situation of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey would afford an example of this kind. So if we look at New York and Connecticut and New Jersey, we can see, again, writing to the people of New York, referencing New York. New York, from the necessities of revenue, must lay duties on her importations. So, because they need to make money, New York's going to have to tax things that are being imported. A great part of these duties must be paid by the inhabitants of the two other states in the capacity of consumers of what we import. So, Connecticut, if you bring something across the state border from Connecticut to New York to sell, you're going to have to pay taxes there. Same thing with New Jersey. New York would neither be willing nor able to forego this advantage. So, because New York is more powerful and wealthy and they have things they want to consume, they couldn't get around this if they tried. They would have to tax their neighbors. Her citizens would not consent that a duty paid by them should be remitted in favor of the citizens of her neighbors. Nor would it be practicable if there were not this impediment in the way, to distinguish the customers in our own markets. So, first of all, New York might be unhappy that they have to pay taxes on things being brought in just from Connecticut when people of Connecticut don't have to pay taxes on that product. Also, it's super impractical because you could just walk across the state border, go to a market and start selling it. How are you going to figure out who came from where? Would Connecticut and New Jersey long submit to be taxed by New York for her exclusive benefit? So how long are Connecticut and New Jersey going to be bringing things into New York if they're getting just all this import taxes put on them, making their price of their product go up? Oh, no, he's going to do a series of questions here. Hamilton likes to ask questions. Should we be long permitted to remain in the quiet and undisturbed enjoyment of a metropolis, from the possession of which we derived an advantage so odious to our neighbors and, in their opinion, so oppressive? So, are Connecticut and New Jersey just going to let New York sit here becoming wealthier and wealthier while we tax our neighbors and they don't make so much money? Or are they going to get angry that they are forced to submit to this kind of system? Should we be able to persevere it against the incumbent weight of Connecticut on the one side and the cooperating pressure of New Jersey on the other? So what if Connecticut and New Jersey team up? These are questions that temerity alone will answer in the affirmative. So eventually, if you take an obvious look at it, you see where I'm going with this, is what Hamilton's saying. The public debt of the Union would be a further cause of collision between the separate states or confederacies. Okay, so we're moving on now to public debt. The Union has debt from the Revolution. It's going to cause trouble between us. Here's why. Let's see what he has to say. The apportionment in the first instance and the progressive extinguishment afterward would be alike productive of ill humor and animosity. So, if we were to be disunited, then dividing up the debts would make people angry. Another question: how would it be possible to agree upon a rule of apportionment satisfactory to all? This is interesting. It's a little bit of a foreshadowing to his assumption plan that comes along several years later. Because he's asking there, how would we even divide it equally? How are we even going to do that? There is scarcely any that can be proposed which is entirely free from real objections. So anything you decide, someone's going to object to justifiably. These, as usual, would be exaggerated by the adverse interests of the parties. So because people have self-interest and states have self-interest, they're going to make bigger claims about why it's terrible than it maybe actually even is. There are even dissimilar views among the states as to the general principle of discharging the public debt. So we can't even decide how to pay it off. You think we're going to decide how to divvy it up amongst ourselves? Some of them, either less impressed with the importance of national credit, or because their citizens have little, if any, immediate interest in the question, feel an indifference, if not a repugnance, to the payment of domestic debt at any rate. So Hamilton obviously loves national credit, and he's saying that states who don't care about paying it off is either because they don't care about national credit, because Hamilton might think they're dummies, or the people of their state have no attachment to national debt. It's just, again, I don't like to talk about modern politics on this channel, but at this point in time, we do have an incredible trillions of dollars of national debt, and for most people who make a couple tens of hundreds, maybe a millions of dollars a year, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even a few $1,000,000 a year, still pales in comparison when you think about the national debt to what your actual everyday lived experience is, and therefore the states have no interest in paying it off because, as he's saying, the people don't care, so it's politically indifferent for them to actually do something about it. These would be inclined to magnify the difficulties of a distribution. Okay, so this just makes it harder to divide it. Again, he's still riding the idea that Anti-Federalists want to disunite the states. This whole paper so far, as with the last one, is, I should save it for the end, but kind of irrelevant to the actual conversation that people are having on the streets and in the papers. Very few people, and none of the real leaders, were saying we should just get rid of the Articles of Confederation. Let's just be our own state. Although, again, that's essentially the theory of this paper. He's disproving an idea that no one is arguing for. It's very strange. The Federalist papers get better, don't worry. Others of them A numerous body of whose citizens are creditors to the public beyond proportion of the state in the total amount of the national debt would be strenuous for some equitable and effective provision. Other states who have a lot of citizens that have credit, some states have a good number of citizens who debt is owed to. A lot of the national debt that was taken out was owed to individuals, not just France. And it would be strenuous. It would be very difficult for them to be treated fairly in the situation he's discussing. The procrastinations of the former would excite the resentment of the latter. So, people taking their time because they don't really have a desire to repay the national debt are going to really adversely affect the people who want to get rid of the national debt. Oh, too far. The settlement of a rule would, in the meantime, be postponed by real differences of opinion and affected delays. So even if we figured out this debt problem and we put a rule into place under the current system, and this is true under the Articles of Confederation, states would just ignore it and find ways to delay paying off the debt. The citizens of the states interested would clamor. Foreign powers would urge for the satisfaction of their just demands, and the peace of the states would be hazarded to the double contingency of external invasion and internal contention. So the people of these different states would want, they'd be angry. Many nations did loan a lot of money, not just France, a little bit from Spain and the Netherlands, who also had a pretty good navy. Not as good as it was, but a pretty good navy. They would want their money back. And the separate states are going to be real slow to make that happen. And it would hazard the peace of the state, so it could lead to some violence. Suppose the difficulties of agreeing upon a rule surmounted and the apportionment made. So let's imagine we came up with a rule and we divide it. So we split up and we divide all this debt amongst ourselves. Still, there is great room to suppose that the rule agreed upon would, upon experiment, be found to bear harder upon some states than others. So we could probably imagine a situation where, should we divide up the debt, some states would have a lot more difficulty paying it off than other states. Those which were sufferers by it would naturally seek for a mitigation of their burden. So the states that couldn't pay back their debts, their portion of the debt, would try and find a way to fix the problem. The others would as naturally be disinclined to a revision, which would likely end in an increase of their own encumbrances. So the states that are paying their debt wouldn't want to change anything because it's only going to make things harder for them. Why? We're doing our job. Do your own job. Their refusal would be too plausible a pretext to the complaining states to withhold their contributions, not to be embraced with avidity, and the non-compliance of these states with their engagements would be a ground of bitter discussion and altercation. So the smaller states that can't pay it would ask for help, the bigger ones wouldn't want to help, and it would lead to tensions, to say the least, between the two. Okay, this is a real long sentence, so we'll break it up. If even the rule adopted should in practice justify the equality of its principle, still, delinquencies in payment on the part of some states would result from a diversity of other causes. The real deficiency of resources. Okay, so we'll end it at causes here. So we make this rule, we divide it up, people are trying to pay it, but even if it is equal in principle, because some parts of the union they still would not be able to pay it. And here are the causes. The real deficiency of resources. They literally don't have the money. Mismanagement of their finances. They have money, they're just screwing it up. Accidental disorders in the management of the government. So the government loses its way a little bit. And in addition to the rest, the reluctance with which men commonly part with money for purposes that have outlived the exigencies which produce them and interfere with the supply of immediate wants. So people don't like to pay for things that they don't feel like they need right now. It's, again, kind of like we were saying before with the debt. You're distant from it, and you don't feel like you should have to give up money for it. It is a natural inclination of us. Delinquencies, from whatever causes, would be productive of complaints, recriminations, and quarrels. So, should someone or a few people not pay, it's going to lead to tensions, as he's been saying. There is, perhaps, nothing more likely to disturb the tranquility of nations than their being bound to mutual contributions for any common object that does not yield an equal and coincident benefit. So, in his opinion, there's nothing that's going to lead to war. Nothing's better for starting a war than trying to work with someone and someone gets more. So if we're going to share, we're going to split the bill and you eat 4 meals and I eat half a meal, I'm going to be angry and start a war with you, more or less. For it is an observation, as true as it is trite, that there is nothing men differ so readily about as the payment of money. So yes, people are ready to argue over money. Right away, people like to argue about money. That is pretty true. Hamilton has a pretty negative view of humanity, though, not necessarily incorrect. Laws in violation of private contracts, as they amount to aggressions on the rights of those states whose citizens are injured by them, may be considered as another probable source of hostility. So, if you make a law that violates a pre-existing contract, it's gonna make some people mad. As kind of we were saying before, for example, with Vermont, where people in New York had bought land in Vermont from the state of New York, and when Vermont was given to New Hampshire, those people just kind of lost their money. Let's see, a little bit long, we can get through it. We are not authorized to expect that a more liberal or more equitable spirit would preside over the legislations of the individual states hereafter. If unrestrained by any additional checks than we have heretofore seen in too many instances disgracing their several codes. So we're not authorized to expect that a more liberal or more equitable spirit would preside over the legislations of individual states. So they wouldn't, after these discussions, they are not going to help each other. They're not going to be out there just being kind. They're going to try and, as he said earlier, improve their own situation. And if unrestrained by checks, so like as we've seen, this might be kind of a reference to Rhode Island, who has, and other states, but there was no check. There was nothing forcing them to participate in helping to pay off the debt. Yes, and here he is going to reference Rhode Island. That's right. We have observed in the disposition to retaliation excite in Connecticut in consequence of the enormities perpetuated by the legislature of Rhode Island. And we reasonably infer that, in similar cases, under the other circumstances, a war, not of parchment, but of the sword, would chastise such atrocious breaches of moral obligation and social justice. So, he's saying Connecticut was mad at Rhode Island. Most people were mad at Rhode Island. I'm not sure what particular issue he's referencing here regarding between Connecticut and Rhode Island. I know that Roger Sherman had written 35 years before Hamilton's writing this, a caveat against injustice, an inquiry into the evils of a fluctuating medium of exchange, which is a long title for a really important book discussing why Connecticut should not, as a colony at the time, accept Rhode Island currency. But I do think the real problem with Rhode Island at this point is they're the state that wasn't sending any money to pay off their debts to the Continental Congress. Although they did pay off their own debts, to be fair. Just not the shared debts. And interesting social, I guess Hamilton's being a social justice warrior right now. Interesting. The probability of incompatible alliances between the different states or confederacies and different foreign nations, and the effects of this situation upon the peace of the whole, have been sufficiently unfolded in some preceding papers. So he's saying, my boy John Jay already wrote why breaking down into separate states or confederacies would lead to war. And even though he's essentially been repeating a lot of that stuff throughout this particular piece here. This is a very long sentence. This is a very long sentence. We'll break it down. From the view they have exhibited of this part of the subject, this conclusion is to be drawn, that America, if not connected at all, or only by the feeble tie of a simple league, offensive and defensive, would, by the operation of such jarring alliances, be gradually entangled in all the pernicious labyrinths of European politics and war. So, again, here he's again saying if we should break up, or he references the articles here, the tie of a simple league, which at least he's referencing the articles by calling them a simple league and making, essentially downplaying how they work. Even under the Articles of Confederation, Hamilton's saying, eventually, alliances will be formed between the states, and we're going to end up like Europe, where there's all these nations packed on a continent next to each other that just go to war for seemingly no reason. And by the destructive contentions of the parts into which she was divided, would be likely to become prey to the artifices and machinations of powers equally the enemies of them all. So if they break down like this, if we get tied into European-style wars and politics, we're all going to be taken over by someone who's more powerful than all of us. Not powerful than all of us combined, but more powerful than all of us divided. Divide et impera must be the motto of every nation that either hates or fears us. Divide and impera is essentially divide and conquer. Divide and conquer must be the motto of every nation that either hates or fears us. So the goal of other nations to take over North America is going to be divide these states. And that's where he leaves it off. Publius, though his implication at the end here is certainly that the if we don't unite under the Constitution, we are going to be dealing with each other and with Europe. I'll bring myself back up here. He does kind of throw that in at the end randomly. Again, I try to be as objective as I can on this channel. I am trying to look at history very objectively, but when we're reading these political papers, it's a little bit more difficult because we are talking about political theory, the basis of American political theory, making it more difficult to be objective and not take sides. As someone who's written about and read tons of anti-federalist papers, I can discuss both sides. I don't love this paper. I know Hamilton is having a moment now, especially as a writer, but just like the last one, number 6, he has just so many questions. It's the same question over and over again. He just asks it in different ways. And this one, the whole point of the paper is to attack the idea of being disunited. He only mentions the Articles of Confederation twice. The last time there wasn't even by name. He was just referencing a simple league. He's attacking the idea of dividing into separate, unattached nations, which, again, really wasn't being spoken about. Even the people who were talking about separate confederacies, they would be localized confederacies. So when he's making the example of Connecticut and New York and New Jersey and Connecticut being jealous of New York, at least New Jersey probably would have been under the same alliance as New York, if not Connecticut, though Connecticut might have been New England. It's a very interesting little division there. And again, it wasn't really an argument. He spends the whole time arguing what would happen if we did disunite. So even though no one's acknowledging that, he's going to come back in future papers and say, so what we got to do is unite, right? Because look how bad I said it was going to be. And we will leave that until next time. Sometime next week, probably Monday, we will come back with Federalist number 8. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, do me a favor and hit like. Subscribe if you're new here. I put out videos about the American Revolution 7 days a week, and we are going through all 85 Federalist papers along the way over the next several months. So please join us. Thank you for joining us today, and I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.